on behalf of St James Ethics Centre, the Wheeler Centre, the Age, the City of Melbourne and the ABC, I'd like to welcome you here this evening to the Melbourne Town Hall for the last debate in the third season of Intelligence Squared debates being held here in Melbourne. Tonight we are gathered on the traditional lands of the Kulin Nation, and I wish to acknowledge them as the traditional owners and also to pay my personal respects and the respects of those of us here on the stage to their elders and to the elders of other communities who might be here this evening. My name is Simon Longstaff. I'm the Executive Director of St James Ethics Centre, and I'm delighted to chair tonight's debate. Now, some of you might be inclined to be tweeting tonight. If you are a tweeter, there is live tweeting available using the hashtag IQ2OZ, IQ2Oz. And to all of you, of course, I extend a really hearty welcome. And you will have found on your chair a formal voting ticket, and later on this evening you'll be asked to cast your ballot. And that will allow us at the end of the evening to make a comparison to do with what you thought before the debate and then how you've decided after hearing the arguments. It's a simple process. You tear it in half if you have made up your mind, for or against. If you're still undecided, and I hope that you won't be, then just leave that voting ticket as one whole piece and cast it accordingly. I should just explain about the topic. I hope people understand that when it was being framed, it was taken for granted, and perhaps it shouldn't be, that we're talking here about voluntary euthanasia. There's no one debating the proposition that people should be compulsorily euthanised. That would be a dangerous topic, maybe for the Festival of Dangerous Ideas, but that's not what we're talking about tonight. We're talking about voluntary and assisted euthanasia. And to address that topic, I'm going to introduce the two sides. I'll introduce them all as a group and then ask you to welcome them in the usual way. So, speaking for the motion, the first speaker is Beth Wilson, who became Victoria's Health Services Commissioner in 1997. She's a lawyer by training and has worked mainly in administrative law. She has a long-standing interest in medico-legal and ethical issues. Prior to becoming Health Services Commissioner, Beth was the President of the Mental Health Review Board, a senior legal member of the Social Security Appeals Board and Work Care Appeals Board, and she's a past President of the Victorian branch of the Australian and New Zealand Association of Psychiatry, Psychology and Law. In 2007, Beth was appointed a member of the Disability Services Board. She's joined by the second speaker, Professor Lowen Skeen, a Professor of Law in the Faculty of Law and also an Adjunct Professor in the Faculty of Medicine, Dentistry and Health Sciences at the University of Melbourne. She's a member of the NHMRC Legislation Review Committee on Human Cloning and Embryo Research, the HERE Committee, the Australian Health Ethics Committee, which is one of the principal committees of the National Health and Medical Research Council, and the Australian Workforce Advisory Council. She served on numerous federal and state advisory committees, especially in relation to genetics and the law. And the third speaker for the affirmative is Dr. Philip Nitschke. He's got both a degree in medicine and also a PhD. And for more than a decade, Philip has been the face and the voice of the voluntary euthanasia debate in Australia and around the world. He's the author of a book called The Peaceful Pill Handbook, which is banned in this country, and Killing Me Softly, Voluntary Euthanasia and the Road to the Peaceful Pill, published by Penguin in 2005. Would you please welcome the speakers for the affirmative? Speaking against the motion, the first speaker is Dr. Shakira Hussain, a Mackenzie postdoctoral fellow at the Asia Institute at the University of Melbourne. Her research focuses on Muslim women, gendered violence and racialised political discourse. She completed her doctorate at the Australian National University and is a regular media contributor on issues including gender, multiculturalism and Islam. She's joined by somebody whose voice you'll probably immediately recognise if you listen to the ABC, and particularly with Waleed Ali's Drive program, Scott Stevens, who's the Religion and Ethics Editor for ABC Online, but also appears on radio and television. He's the editor-translator of the selected writings of the philosopher Slavoj Žižek and is currently working on books with theologian John Milbank and literary critic James Wood. He's a regular commentator on ABC Radio National and, of course, on the telly. Before joining the ABC in 2010, Scott Stevens taught theology and ethics for many years, and he also trained for the priesthood and served for several years as a lay parish minister in the Uniting Church. And finally, the third speaker for the negative is Associate Professor Bill Silvester, who's the Director of the Respecting Patient Choices program at the Austin Hospital. He's also an intensive care specialist and a medical consultant for Donate Life, the Victorian Organ Donation Service, and the President of the International Society of Advanced Care Planning and End-of-Life Care. His current professional areas of interest include advanced care planning, end-of-life care and organ donation. He undertook his original training in Perth and London and has been at the Austin Hospital since 1996. Would you please welcome them all? Ladies and gentlemen, the proposition before this House is that euthanasia should be legalised. I now invite Beth Wilson to address this House with her arguments for the affirmative.
Thank you. I too would like to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land that we're meeting on tonight and to pay my respects to their elders past and present. And I'd also like to acknowledge any Indigenous people who might be here in the audience with us tonight. Whenever I have this privilege of acknowledging the first people of our great nation, it always reminds me about my own elders and how important they are in my life. My mother's 92 years of age. She lives at home. She mows the lawn, which is a bit embarrassing when she mows out the front. I can just hear the townsfolk. Will you look at that poor old woman? Her daughter's the Health Services Commissioner. You think she could afford a gardener for her poor old mum? But pity help anyone who tries to get between my mother and that mower. And my mother's name is Isa May Wilson, and my favourite photograph of her is with her newly born great-granddaughter in her arms, and she's called Anna Isa May. Lovely photograph to have. And of course I consulted with Mum about the sensitive and important topic of euthanasia, voluntary euthanasia that we're debating tonight, and Mum said, "I want it." She said, "I talked to your brother about it and he wants it too." I was surprised because Mum usually tries to have as much suffering involved in her life as possible, being the only daughter in a family of 10. But it's really interesting. I'd give Mum anything that she asked me for, but I can't give her voluntary assisted euthanasia because it's illegal. I guess you all know you're here tonight. It's terrific. We know each and every single one of us has one thing in common. We're all going to die. Despite Botox, despite liposuction and anti-ageing creams and the claims of the so-called anti-ageing industry, we are all going to die. Last time anybody checked, the mortality rate for human beings was still 100%. We might look a bit different than we used to, all stretched, but we're going to die. So voluntary assisted euthanasia has got to be legalised to allow each one of us to make a choice about whether we will accept treatment or not, whether we decide whether the treatment we're getting is futile. The word futile, of course, has different meanings to different people, but it is very important that we can express our own choices about what happens to us. And that's why the law needs to be clarified so that our doctors are not breaking the law or risking manslaughter charges when they do respect patient choices. And also the awful sight of desperate relatives who've tried to assist a loved one and who are then put on trial for manslaughter. About a year ago, I was diagnosed with breast cancer. Luckily for me, it was very early detection, which is why I wear Breast Screen Victoria's logo every day. They saved my life. But any encounter with Jimmy Dancer inevitably makes you think about your own mortality. In fact, when I went with great trepidation to get my pathology results, the surgeon said, while I was still mid-air, my bum hadn't even touched the seat, he said, "Oh, it's good news, Beth, you've got a 95% chance of dying of something else." And I said, could you just let me wrap my head around the good news before you start reminding me about all the other things that are going to help me to shake off this mortal coil? What he said was true, but I didn't think a whole lot of his sense of timing. At the same time as I was dealing with breast cancer, my beautiful golden retriever, Bo, also was diagnosed with cancer. He was much sicker than me. Fortunately, I was able to make sure he didn't suffer too much. He was humanely euthanised, and like all golden retrievers, he ate liver treats until his very last breath. But isn't it strange that we live in a world where I can do that for my dog, but not for a person I love? Legalised euthanasia is a voluntary concept. It's about choice. My dear step-granddaughters, Jemima and Charlotte, are 12 and 8, and I talked to them about euthanasia, and they asked me to explain what I meant about it, and they just stared at me and said, "But shouldn't it be their choice?" Spot on, girls. Euthanasia does not suddenly become compulsory just because it's legalised. It is voluntary. It includes the right of competent individuals to make advance directives setting out what their choices would be or should be if they become incapable of expressing those choices for themselves. Informed consent is a very important legal concept. It's about the rights of patients to be given sufficient information to allow us to participate in decision-making about which treatments we will or will not accept. So informed consent recognises choice. So why on earth then are we able to give informed decisions, informed choice on all aspects of our healthcare, except perhaps what is most important of all, the way we die? Denying people the right of choice is a very outdated remnant of paternalism at its very worst. Everyone has the right to be treated with dignity and respect, and patient autonomy is very paramount here. It should not be simply what churches or medical advisors consider is right or best for us. Every single one of us should be able to have the right to participate in and direct what healthcare we will receive. And to do that well, we need to be health literate, we need to be given accurate and adequate information, and the legal ability to refuse treatment. Legalised euthanasia does not negate the need for accessible palliative care services. I've been an advocate of palliative care services for a long time. I think they do an absolutely fantastic job in providing support for people who are dying and their families. And the palliative care volunteers are fantastic people who give their time free of charge to be with the dying and their families, and they make a huge difference. However, I am also told by people that someone they loved, the palliative care was fantastic up to a point, but a time came when it was no longer sufficient, and they were not able to ensure that their loved ones had a comfortable death. Too many people have endured unnecessary suffering while their doctors try not so much to prolong life as to ward off death. Those of us who are arguing for legalised voluntary euthanasia, we care about our elders. We care about the ill, and we care about people with disabilities. Voluntary legalised euthanasia does not discriminate against those people. It discriminates for them. It's positive discrimination by allowing them to decide what is best for them and what they may find unendurable. Arguing in favour of legalised voluntary euthanasia is entirely consistent with supporting aged, disabled or unwell people to live healthy, happy lives. Arguing in favour of legalised voluntary euthanasia is consistent with arguing for accessible and appropriate pain management. Our health policy should be based on principles of social justice, patient-centred care and autonomy, and legalised euthanasia is consistent with these principles. Too many people are committing suicide where they've received diagnoses like dementia, very intelligent, health literate people making lonely choices in bleak circumstances with family members coming across the results of that. If you need any further evidence, ask ambulance officers what they see. Their point of view is very often not included in the public debate. Dying should be a time when human beings are treated with the utmost respect, a time when excellent health services are available for us and excellent support is there for our families and carers. It's not a time when we should be abandoned. Ladies and gentlemen, the only sure way to respect people's wishes is to make voluntary assisted euthanasia legal so that we all have a choice. Thank you.
Dr. Shakira Hassan.
So I am sitting rather than standing at the lectern tonight in order not to be distracted from my own presentation by the effort to stay vertical. My balance and physical strength have been eroded by remitting relapsing multiple sclerosis. However, while multiple sclerosis may have made it more of an effort to be here, it's also the reason why I'm here. Like most of us, I had not given too much thought to the question of how I would deal with some of the deepest human fears until they stared me in the face. The fear of physical decline and dependence, the fear of protracted physical pain. Euthanasia is often suggested as a means of circumventing these bleak experiences. And some people with multiple sclerosis say that it is an option they would seek to exercise were it to be available for them. And that's a sentiment that I entirely understand. In between flares, my health is relatively strong, and I emphasise the relative. But the flares provide a premonition of the future, a future that is full of unpleasant possibilities. MS is a disease of the brain and the central nervous system, an unpredictable drama queen of an illness. But so far, none of its surprises have been pleasant. And I would just as soon not experience too much of what it may have in store for me. But I think that the high level of public support in most opinion polls about euthanasia reflects, at least in part, a reluctance to contemplate such unpleasant possibilities. We like to think that if legalised euthanasia were to become available, we would not need to experience the horrors that may lurk in all of our futures for longer than we think we can bear. We do not need to plan for them, to make provision for them, to imagine what they may do to us, because we hope to be able to head for the exit soon after they show their ugly faces. We are only just beginning to grapple with the issues raised by the fact that modern medicine has succeeded in lengthening life expectancy without so far providing a commensurate improvement in the quality of life in its final stages, or for those with chronic diseases, some distance from its final stages. We face the imminent prospect of an ageing population, described by the novelist Martin Amis as a silver tsunami, and an invasion of terrible immigrants stinking out the restaurants and cafes and shops. Amos, at age 60, at the time of writing, identified himself as soon to be among the ranks of these smelly immigrants, by the way. He suggests that governments deal with this blight by providing euthanasia booths on street corners where old people could, check in to check out. Amos's tone may have been satirical, but his support for legalised euthanasia is, deadly serious, and I wrote those last two words without realising the double meaning given the topic. Of course there are no serious proposals to make euthanasia compulsory. Euthanasia advocates retort that since they have no intention of imposing their choice upon me, I am not entitled to deny them their choice. Euthanasia, they maintain, is the patient's private decision which has no effect on anyone outside of their own network. Its advocates generally present themselves as rugged individuals battling to throw off the shackles of the state which would deny them their choice. But I would argue that legalising euthanasia grants the state more power rather than less. Legalised euthanasia would not take place in a vacuum. As is appropriate for all medical procedures, it would be state-regulated and monitored, and the states would presumably be partially or fully state-subsidised. And I do not believe that it is appropriate for the state to determine that the desire to end one's life is in some circumstances a disease to be combated and controlled, and in other cases a rational decision to end a life that is seen as holding less value. I do not believe that legalised state-endorsed euthanasia would be an autonomous decision in either the circumstances in which it is made or in terms of its consequences for others. The social stigma attached to diseased and disabled bodies would both shape euthanasia decisions and be reinforced by them. Even those who would not themselves contemplate euthanasia would have their lives devalued by its availability to them. I agree with euthanasia advocates on one point. Under our current health system, many sick and dying patients suffer an unnecessary degree of pain and misery. But I do not believe that the lack of availability of euthanasia is one such manifestation of unnecessary suffering. A society that does not grant speedy and universal access to best practice pain management and palliative care has no business offering euthanasia as a substitute. Some analysts argue that we already accommodate so-called passive euthanasia in the form of withdrawal of treatment and/or painkillers that may, or may not, hasten death. This, they argue, is unregulated euthanasia by stealth. Legalising euthanasia would streamline the practice, bring it out of the shadows. But I do not see either of these practices as occupying the same ethical space as active euthanasia. Medical treatment may help to extend life, but it also generates adverse and unwanted side effects that may be more unpleasant than the underlying disease. To impose these side effects without consent is assault. Withdrawing treatment may hasten death, but where the intent is to improve the quality of what life remains, it's an option that patients may justifiably choose. The same general principle applies to the use of pain medication used to enhance life at the expense of possibly shortening it, even probably shortening it. Sick people take those kind of risks throughout the course of their disease. On a micro level, it's a risk-benefit assessment that we all take, or certainly we all should take, every time we gulp down a Panadol for a headache. Tim Ferguson, veteran of the Doug Anthony All-Stars and stand-up comedian, whose career with the All-Stars, it turns out, was cut short by his diagnosis with multiple sclerosis, describes how his doctor explained the implications of this diagnosis. The good news is, it's not going to kill you. The bad news is, it's not going to kill you. And I have to say that the reasonably limited impact of multiple sclerosis on life expectancy does not strike me as being unqualified good news. But if and when I should be overwhelmed by these sentiments, to the point of asking my health professionals, even my family, to help me to end my life, I want the people that I ask to be legally obligated to refuse, to look for other options, to say no. And I won't take this refusal well. I'll be a bad patient. I'll be so annoying that I probably won't need legalised euthanasia because, my healthcare professionals, perhaps other residents of whatever institution I end up being cared for in, they'll murder me and think that a prison sentence is a small price to pay. But that's how it is. I'll throw tantrums. I might even demand it. I might look back on this talk and think it was all a dreadful mistake, but I'll be wrong. And I should be told so. And I should be helped to find ways to live, not ways to die. but not final.
I'll take that back to the thing.
We should legalise euthanasia. This is obviously a legal question, and I'm going to put to you some legal arguments. I'll be showing you how the law has moved in various ways, which could arguably be towards legalising voluntary euthanasia. I want to do this in the context of the stories of the patients, and to look how the courts have regarded the circumstances that have come before them. So think about Tony Bland. He was 17 years old when he went to the Hillsborough soccer stadium to watch the soccer in northern England. And suddenly there was a great surge of the crowd pushing people forward, and he was caught on a cyclone wire fence with people crushing against him. And as a result of this, his chest was crushed, he didn't get oxygen to the brain, and he suffered severe brain damage. He was taken to hospital, and for 3 years he lay there, obviously not able to communicate, to improve his condition at all. His nurses and parents carefully looked after him, but in the end it became clear to people that this life was not one that this young man would have wanted to live. So the hospital and the parents together applied to the court for an order that it would be lawful to withdraw the treatment that Tony Bland was getting. And this went to the highest court in England, the House of Lords, and the judges there said it was lawful to withdraw this treatment. There were 3 reasons. It was futile to continue it when it couldn't achieve anything. It imposed a burden on him which was not justified by the prognosis, and therefore it wasn't in his best interests to have the treatment continued. So the treatment was withdrawn. And this included artificial feeding and hydration. It took him 11 days to die. There have been lots of similar cases since then. Some of them you'll be familiar with. The case of Terry Schiavo, who had a fall in Florida, suffered brain damage, and then for years was kept in care while 20 judges over 7 years considered whether it was lawful to withdraw the treatment. Ultimately, that was decided to be lawful, and the treatment was withdrawn, again with the authority of the court. In Melbourne, we remember Maria Corp, whose body was left for dead in the boot of her car in South Melbourne. So she's lying in hospital in what was categorised as a persistent vegetative state, and an application was made to VCAT, the Victorian Civil and Administrative Tribunal, that it would be lawful to withdraw treatment, and that decision was made. Similarly in BWV, a woman with Pick's disease, and her body was curled up in the fetal position for 3 years. She couldn't get any better, and it was decided that it would be lawful to withdraw treatment. Now, the second category of patients are those who may not be as sick as the first lot, but are able to communicate. And these patients are able to refuse treatment. So we think back to the days of John McEwen in the 1980s in Victoria. He was an Australian water skiing champion, and he became a quadriplegic after a diving accident. And he decided that he didn't want to live this life on a ventilator. At that time, the law was not clear, and so proceedings were taken to have him sectioned, declared incompetent under the Mental Health Act, so that he could continue to be treated even though he didn't want that to happen. But publicity about that case, and other cases of a similar kind, led to an inquiry in Victoria, which in turn led to the passing of the Medical Treatment Act. And that enables people to refuse treatment, provided they follow the procedure in the Act. Similar legislation was passed in Western Australia after Christian Rossiter's case, and he was also a paraplegic that didn't want his treatment to be continued. Most recently, judges have been saying, particularly in New South Wales, that it is lawful for people to make an advance directive refusing treatment at common law. You don't have to rely on legislation. So you can refuse dialysis in advance, for example, and that directive will later be honoured at the time when there's a decision being made about that treatment. So summing up to date, we've got cases where patients are critically ill and can't communicate, and it may be lawful to discontinue their treatment so they die. And we've got cases where the patients may not be critically ill, but they can communicate and they're entitled to refuse treatment, and that is binding on the doctors and other health professionals. Now, you'll say that those cases involve treatment being withdrawn. What about positive steps that doctors might take that might hasten the death of a patient? Well, the law envisages that that can happen too, through the doctrine of what is the so-called double effect. If a doctor gives a patient a drug, even though he or she knows that that drug will definitely cause the patient to die more quickly, but the intention of the doctor is to relieve the patient's pain and not to expedite the patient's death, then that is not unlawful. So this gives doctors a lot of leeway in cases where the patient has severe pain which could be alleviated by giving a particular drug. So you can see that the law's come a long way in helping critically ill patients to die. If the patient can communicate and refuse treatment, then the law will work well. If they have unbearable pain that can be relieved by a drug that shortens their life, the law will also work well. But it will not help patients who are not being kept alive by life-sustaining measures that can be removed, or who have pain that cannot be relieved by drugs or overwhelming distress arising from their circumstances. So this is the gap that Beth Wilson referred to. Therapeutic measures or palliative care are good so far as they go, but there is this gap where palliative care is not the answer. Think of the case of Diane Pretty, who was paralysed by motor neurone disease. She couldn't take her own life, which would not be a crime because suicide is no longer a crime. And she couldn't end her life by refusing treatment because she wasn't dependent on a ventilator. Yet her condition would inevitably deteriorate, and you can imagine that she would not want to live a life like that. So if she's fully informed and wants it, why shouldn't a doctor be allowed to give her a drug to allow her to die? Is this situation so different from giving a drug to ease pain or distress, knowing that it may cause or hasten her death? Can doctors reasonably say that they did not intend the outcome on the principle of double effect when the foreseeable consequence of their action is that the patient will die or die more quickly? Isn't it hypocritical to say that switching off a life support machine is not an act but an omission to struggle? Or that the patient then dies from the illness and not from the drug? Is it fair for one patient to be allowed to die and the other to be condemned to be kept alive?
Good evening. The feverishness, the intensity over euthanasia continues on unabated. And given, I suppose, how deeply personal, how deeply felt this issue is for so many of us, that shouldn't be surprising, should it? What is surprising, however, is that this debate seems utterly disconnected, out of step from the advances in pain management over the last couple decades in particular. Indeed, it seems almost entirely separated, despite some of the things we've heard tonight, from a more serious conversation about the benefits of more holistic and even the more pastoral dimensions that often accompany palliative and hospice care. The fact that these two things are out of step, that we are better perhaps than we've ever been at managing pain, and yet this frenzy, this desperation in some quarters of society to see euthanasia legalized, that suggests to me that perhaps there's something else at play here. Perhaps the issue isn't simply claiming the right to die per se, but that the very desperation to be able to claim this right to die is symptomatic of something else. So, what might this something else be? Well, I'd like to suggest to you in the time that I have that this something else is in fact a kind of hydra-headed monster. And because of that, any serious debate of what makes a good death today really can't take place unless there's some kind of acknowledgement, there's some sort of identification of the fearsome form of this hydra. And so I'd like to suggest to you this evening that the push to place, let's be clear about what we're talking about here, the push to place within the ambit of medicine itself the ability to end a person's life proactively, when that life is no longer deemed to be of benefit. The push, in other words, to endorse medical killing as a practice integral to the practice of medicine itself, that this very push is symptomatic of the fact that, first of all, we live in a time in which the greatest of all human virtues is the ability to choose, the degree of personal autonomy. In fact, in our time, we have begun to assert the freedom, the rights, and indeed the pleasure of the individual body over and against any other person or institution that might lay a claim on that body, whether it be one's nation, one's tradition, one's community, one's marriage, one's children, or one's religion. We live in a time, in other words, where we all participate in some form or another in a kind of religion of the body. This body, in other words, that dominates in our time is actually quite an ahistoric concept. It's a body that's stripped away. It's a body that's removed from those things that in the past used to determine individual existence. The idea being, of course, that each of us are born into networks of obligation that we don't necessarily choose, but that we must of necessity acknowledge. The idea, in other words, is that our lives are not simply our own, but our lives belong to those who love us, and indeed who are loved by us. Today, however, the human body is only determined by that which we choose. Secondly, this push to legalize euthanasia is a symptom, it seems to me, of a withering away of the very social bonds within which notions like human dignity, honor, respect, obligation, a withering away of those very bonds within which dignity once made sense. As we've seen so often of late, especially in debates surrounding asylum seekers, we live in a time in which certain rights that are supposed to be inherent to human bodies are suspended at moments of convenience for the state or indeed other institutions. I think that tells us something. It tells us that human rights are very irregularly things that can be simply attributed, ascribed to a person by virtue of their humanness, but instead the very notion of those rights, what makes them meaningful in the way in which we actually live, is that those rights grow up organically. Those rights are defined in a way by the very relationships in which we live. And yet in our time, it seems to me that this notion of dignity has been stripped back and indeed suspended at the very moments, not just of political convenience, but also in many of the ways in which we've ostracized, we've separated out the process of dying from human life. I simply don't believe that the push to legalize euthanasia can be separated from the way, for instance, that we have largely abdicated responsibility for our unwanted elderly, choosing instead to shovel them away behind the opaque walls of third-party care. I do not believe that the push to legalize euthanasia can simply be separated from the way in which we ourselves as a society have decided to choose that our lives will not be constrained by the lives, the needs, the dependencies of others, whether those be our unwanted elderly or indeed our unwanted unborn. I also don't believe that the push to legalize euthanasia can be separated from the way in which we have hidden the process of dying from the normal processes of human living. The way, in other words, that dying has become overly medicalized, entrapped behind multiple layers of medical paraphernalia and sterile bureaucratization. The final head to this multi-headed Hydra monster is, in fact, that the right to death is a symptom of the overarching fear of our slow loss of autonomy in old age, the fear of the inexorable advance of extreme dependence, that we are living in a unique time, it seems, when that fear has replaced the fear of death itself. And so bringing all these things together, we have come to view our own lives as private property, and therefore lives that ought to be determined by nothing other than our own choice. And so what I'd like to submit to you, friends, is that the desire to legalize euthanasia is not, at bottom, a compassionate desire to alleviate the problem of unnecessary and undignified suffering. But rather, the push to legalize euthanasia is, in fact, the final solution to a problem that we ourselves have created by so eroding the social bonds that make human life meaningful, that give human life not just the sense of meaning and purpose and greater value, but also those very forms of obligation and dependency that make life important to the very end, both for those cared for and those being cared. Perhaps it's a fault of my imagination, but I'm not haunted by the images that Shakira invoked before of euthanizing clinics on every corner. I'm not haunted by the images of dead bodies being shoveled away into anonymous graves that used to always accompany Jack Kevorkian, you'll recall those allegations. I'm not a vitalist. I don't believe that the prolongation of human life is the only or even the greatest good. I don't have fears for either of those things. I am, however, concerned by a society that has so fetishized individual autonomy, that has so fetishized choice, that it has led to the overarching condition today where, as we age, we fear of being loved.
Yes, should we legalise euthanasia? is the question we're here debating, and we've got two groups. We've got a group here, and one of them saying that we should, and we've got another group saying we shouldn't. It seems to me we're saying, should we leave things as they are? Are we happy with that? Or do we want to embrace some change, and are there good reasons for embracing that change? Now, clearly I think we should embrace the change. It's not good enough to leave things the way they are. And to give you an example, or to flesh out a little bit about why we can't leave things the way they are, I'd like to pick up on a point that was raised by Dr. Shakira when she made the point that she didn't want the state wading its heavy hands into this issue by bringing about legislative change and having the state a player in who gets the right to help to die. Now, the point I want to make is that what we've got right now isn't very satisfactory, and I see a lot of it. What we've got right now is a situation where the state is already a player in this question. It's not this disinterested group. It plays a very active role in making sure that you don't get choice. Let me give you some examples of how that is the case. Just supposing, well, of course the obvious one is that they won't bring about legislative change which will allow you to get legal help to have help to die. But so you decide now, without that law coming in, that you want to end your own life. All right, how are you going to do it? You're going to have to get some drugs to do that. You're going to have to get, if you want the best of the peaceful deaths, the best of the drugs, and that's Nembutal. Well, the state's made it very clear you're not going to get that easily. You're going to have to import it. That's going to be against the law. They've recently increased the penalties. They put out a briefing sheet last year saying that if any hapless elderly folk try to go to Mexico to get that drug, or Peru or China, you might be looking at a $250,000 fine or 25 years in prison for bringing in a drug that you simply want to give you that choice of a peaceful death. So that's the state being a player. Now, I tried to get around that using the special access scheme as a doctor to import the drug for 4 of my dying patients. Again, the state was a player. It referred it off to APRA, that medical body which sits out there, and they said, let's see if we can get this doctor and show that he's not a fit and proper person to be a doctor in Australia. That investigation's still going on because I attempted to get this drug, which would provide the best and most peaceful and reliable death to a patient, brought in for them. Well, that didn't work, so I thought, we'll try something else. And earlier this year, we developed a scheme, a lawful scheme. No illegal importing of drugs, a lawful scheme using bottles of nitrogen, that ubiquitous gas we're all sitting in the room breathing here, where with a cylinder of that gas, you can have a reliable and peaceful death. It seemed a very straightforward process. We developed the scheme. We made it available to our members. We've sold over hundreds of them now to our members, but the state didn't like that. It said you can't go around doing lawful things like that. And again, they referred it to APRA, the medical body. The Medical Regulatory Board came back and said to me, we don't think that your activities, even though they're lawful, constitute actions which would make you a fit and proper person to hold medical registration in this fine country. So now I've got 2 simultaneous inquiries going into my fit and proper status. The state is a player. It's making its views clear. You are not going to be able to end your lives. When we tried to put the information out so that you could read about it yourself and form your own opinion, have an informed decision, what did the state do? The state banned the book. It was mentioned in the introduction. The only book banned in Australia in 35 years. That's quite an achievement to have written something that evil. But there it was. The Attorney-General overruled the decision, the independent decision of the Office of Film and Literature Classification, and got their way. The state is playing a position, taking a position. You are not going to have choice. We're going to make sure that it never happens. So the state is a player, and the state's right into, up to its grubby little groin. The state is a player, and that's the point. And so when we come along here and debate this issue, we don't want a state in, state out decision. We want to decide whether or not we can reposition the role of the state, and that's what I'm going to be stating today, that the introduction of legislation is to reposition that position, play the role that the state play. Now, in the audience today, there's Jay Franklin. Some people will have read about him in The Age 3 weeks ago. Jay Franklin was born with Hirschsprung's disease. He's now 35. He's had 35 years of this particular condition, and he's formed a pretty informed position that he doesn't want it any longer. He was given the news from the Austin Hospital that there is no more medical options for him. He's battled this for 35 years, and he says, now I want to take this course and be able to end my life. But the state is going to make quite sure that he doesn't get that choice. Because what can he do? They won't bring in legislative change. He's not terminally ill. He can't get the drugs. I suppose he could stop eating and drinking, but that's grim. He could buy a gun or a rope and hang himself or shoot himself. What is his choice? What I'm arguing is that you've got to get right away from this state. And so the best thing perhaps for him to do is to get out of the control of this state, go to a different one, go to Switzerland. Because at least there you've got a state with the courage to engage with this issue and not play its role making sure that people don't get this option. So that's what I'm suggesting. Now, Jay's problem, of course, is that he doesn't have any money. Luckily, through Exit, my organisation, he met up with Dave Bedford in Brisbane, who's had 10 years of high quadriplegia. He's 30 years old, a third of his life spent as a high quadriplegic. He's had enough too. He's not terminally ill though, but he can't do anything. How's he going to end his life? Luckily, he has some money. And so the two will help each other, and that's nice. The two will help each other to get the hell out of this state, to get right away from Australia, go to Switzerland, where there someone will come along and say, you've made an informed decision, here is Nembutal. Drink it if you want to, don't drink it if you don't want to, you die in Zurich. You couldn't have that choice back in Australia because your government didn't have the willingness to engage with legislative change. And it's not just legislative change. There are other things the state needs to do. Bring in legislation for people that are terminally ill. Of course, give them lawful options to end their life. Decriminalise assisted suicide. It's ridiculous. Suicide's not a crime. The state seems to be saying you can go home and kill yourself. We don't care. It's not a crime. But anyone who assists you can be looking at a decade in prison. In Queensland, Western Australia, those enlightened states, it can be life imprisonment for doing something that's lawful. Get rid of this anomaly. If you can't get help, people don't get help and they flounder around, they become desperate. Desperate people do desperate things. The commonest method the elderly use in Melbourne 2012 to end their lives is not by going to Zurich, it's by hanging themselves. Now, I think we ought to be ashamed. I think our politicians ought to be ashamed of the fact that they will not break with the pressures that they see and bring about legislative change is a damning indictment on our politicians. Yes, they're motivated, they're pressured by religious pressures, but they should have some courage. Maybe it'll happen in Tasmania. At last, we've finally got a premier. After 16 years from Marshall Perrin in the Northern Territory, that most secular place in the nation, finally we have a place in Tasmania where we might see legislative change. So look, we've got to see changes, and on top of all of those changes, legislative changes, decriminalise assisting suicide, and for God's sake, get rid of the censorship, the deadly hand of censorship, which stops us telling people how they can have a peaceful death for fear they might use it. The government strategy, keep people sitting in a room, smiling at the walls, giving them no information, and they'll just live long and happier lives. It's rubbish. Give people information, you inform them, you empower them, and that leads to a healthier society. Thank you.
I've been caring for dying people for almost 30 years, and I've been an intensive care specialist for 25 years, looking after people after car accidents and strokes through to transplants and cancer. In fact, I'd contest that I've had more experience with dying patients than anyone else in this room. For the last decade, I've spent an increasing part of my working day researching, developing and implementing advanced care planning. which is a term to describe something quite simple. How do we ensure that we talk to people and their loved ones about what to do if that person becomes too ill to tell us what they want, when we as doctors have to make life and death decisions? I still find it fascinating that whenever I talk to anyone, whether it be a federal minister for health and ageing or a taxi driver, everyone relates to this in a personal way. We've all known someone who's died, and the story has either gone well or it's gone badly. So, just last Tuesday, one of my medical colleagues asked her next-door neighbour to look after her son so that she and her husband could be in the audience tonight, and they are. When the neighbour, who I'll call Jill, heard about the debate, she immediately related her own story, that of her mother who had severe dementia and who couldn't be left alone. She was a shadow of her former self. And then, to top it off, her mother got cancer of the bladder, which was complicated by kidney failure. Jill could no longer look after Mum, but rather than to refer her to a hospice, the GP admitted Jill's mum to a nursing home, which is when the problem started. Jill's mum couldn't eat any longer because it was such a struggle and she'd choke on her food. After getting advice from my colleague, Jill fought hard to stop the nursing home from inserting a feeding tube down her throat into her stomach. So instead, the nursing staff force-fed her. Instead of being cared for by the GP who knew her, Jill's mum was now the responsibility of the locum doctors, who really only knew her as Mrs. X in room 4. The locum doctor challenged Jill, saying, "You can't not feed your mum." And as a consequence, her mum missed out on palliative care. She progressively deteriorated, wasted away, and in the last 24 hours that Jill faced was of an unconscious mum who gurgled and gasped until she took her final breath. This was clearly not a good death. Not surprisingly, Jill now thinks that the only answer is euthanasia. And there's the challenge. The challenge for those of us who believe that there is nothing legal and humane in the way we can allow people to die with dignity without resorting to euthanasia. Jill will always remember that her mum did not have a good death, and it's easy for all of us in this room to recognise a bad death. So therefore, I'll ask you, in your time between now and when you vote, to think about what makes a good death. Well, we know the answers from the patient's perspective. In fact, there are 5 elements that people who are dying have told us make a good death. And what they're really telling us is these are the things that will help me live as well as possible in the time that I've got. So what are they? Firstly, manage my symptoms with good palliative care. That means don't let me suffer. Secondly, avoid prolonging my dying. But that doesn't mean euthanasia, it just means no inappropriate interventions. Thirdly, and crucially, allow me to have control. And fourthly, let me relieve the burden on my family. And this means help me to talk about what I want or don't want before it's too late. And fifthly, help me strengthen my relationships, which means that people want to die knowing their relationships with their family and friends are strong and they have not left things unsaid. Now, all of these desires to live as well as possible until the end can be delivered through good palliative care and through advanced care planning. So when a patient is given the opportunity to tell us what they do or don't want near the end, they regain control. They avoid a prolonged death caused by the paralysis of medical and family decision-making, which is caused by not knowing what mum would want. And as a consequence, they relieve their family of the burden of having to make uninformed decisions, which I have seen hundreds of times in my career. People too often don't know what they have the legal right, or if they are unable to speak for themselves, what their substitute decision maker has the legal right to refuse treatment. So in Jill's case, she had the right to tell the nursing home to stop force-feeding her mother and instead keep her comfortable with medication and good nursing care, including the medication that you heard Lyon Skeen refer to with the doctrine of double effect. Unfortunately, there are too many doctors in our health system who don't understand the existing law that gives them the power to deliver the care that they should be delivering. Now, we showed in a trial conducted at the Austin Hospital that was published in the BMJ that so profound is this burden relief and the certainty of delivering to mum the care that she wanted that it significantly reduced the symptoms of anxiety, depression, and post-traumatic stress disorder in the surviving family members when we assessed them up to 6 months after the death of their loved one. The beauty of involving the family in these intimate and heartfelt discussions is that the elephant in the room, how is mum feeling and what should we do when mum gets sicker, is now out in the open, being discussed freely, which then leaves time to talk about other important things. The result is stronger relationships before it's too late. So what's this got to do with euthanasia? Well, it has everything, because it is these same sorts of factors that cause people to turn to euthanasia when they see no other solution. I still remember the first patient who raised this with me in late 2002. In fact, almost 10 years to the day. I was on the cancer ward at the Austin Hospital, and I just finished discussing her end-of-life wishes with an elderly woman with advanced cancer. And as I walked away, she called me back and said, "Doctor, I'd like to tell you that before our discussion, I was thinking about euthanasia. But you have now reassured me that my wishes will be known and respected when I can no longer speak for myself. I've regained control, and you've lifted such a huge weight from my shoulders, and now I can concentrate on living as well as possible in the remaining time that I have." I've heard many patients express the same sentiments over the years. It tells me that we as doctors can make a profound difference if only we did our job properly, and that means talking honestly with our patients about their end-of-life wishes. It makes such a difference. The same can be found overseas. The Lancet recently published a review of trends in end-of-life practices in the Netherlands since the introduction of euthanasia laws in 2002. They made several findings. Firstly, that there's been a drop in the incidence of doctors performing end-of-life practices without an explicit patient request, and this has been attributed to better palliative care and increased discussions by doctors about their patients' end-of-life preferences. In other words, advanced care planning. Secondly, they've found that there's been intensified alleviation of symptoms independent of euthanasia activity, and this was also found in Belgium at the same time. And this has been attributed to improved palliative care. And thirdly, that the rate of euthanasia or of physician-assisted suicide has not changed since the introduction of the law. We have a legal and ethical solution today. We just need to start using it. Thank you. Well, ladies and gentlemen, you've now heard the arguments from the speakers on the stage, but if you've been to one of these debates before, you'll know they're modelled on the Cambridge and Oxford Union debates, which have a floor debate as an integral part of what's done. So it's now a chance for you, if you would like, to speak in this debate. You might wish to advance an argument of your own. You may wish to pose a question. What I plan to do is to provide an opportunity, and you can see that there are microphones on either wing there, and if you'd come to the microphone, that may mean forming a queue, then you'll be able to have up to a minute to speak. Now, in order to be fair, what I plan to do, even though you might arrive in a different order, is to have those who wish to speak for the motion and against the motion and go in that order, providing what I hope is equal time. If there are enough people who would like to speak about this, then I will provide the opportunity for the panel, of course, along the way to respond to questions or to the comments that are made. So all I'd ask is, if you'd like to do this now, please come forward to either of those two microphone points, and I'll ask you to give your name, and then you have up to a minute to speak. So I see we've got one speaker at the moment. Are you speaking for or against? Okay, so would you please give your name, and your minute begins now.
My name is Fleur Spitzer. I'm 81. My husband is 88. And I think I have the right to choose. For the moment, I'm okay. What I say to people when they say, how are you going? It happens at my age. I say, I'm doing well for my age. Sure, I've got problems. But I don't want to be dependent on anyone else. I've been active all my life, and I want to remain that way, and I want to be able to make my own decisions. And I don't think... I've written letters for my kids 20 years ago to my doctor, something I take to an anaesthetist if I need something, which says, don't revive me. And I have a right at this age to go the way I want it. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. And feel free to applaud people from the floor too. Now, I'm going to move across to this side. Is there somebody who wants to speak against the motion? You may not be at the front of the queue, but if you want to speak against it, yes? Against the motion, say your name now, please, and if you can begin.
I'm not... I think it's too simplistic to say that I'm either for or against the motion, because I think the motion's very complex. And I welcome debates such as this so that people can think about these things and talk through them. So I have a question for Dr. Silvester. If I understand correctly what you're saying about what's happening in the Netherlands, and this will be of interest to people who think that because the legalisation of euthanasia in the Netherlands has caused an increase in the number of practitioners who are administering euthanasia to patients. But in fact, the figures show that it's not the case. And as I understand what you were saying, it actually produces a much better experience for the patients to know that the option is available for them. And it reduces their anxiety. They're able to talk through the issue with their families and their carers. So the availability produces a better life for the patients. Is that correct?
Thank you. Well, now we're going to take some of these questions on notice and wrap them together. Somebody who wants to speak for the motion? Yes?
Hello. My position may be seen as selfish, but I believe it's a fundamental part of this argument or this debate, and that is, whose life is this? Who owns my life? Is it the state? Is it the church? I know that Scott Stevens believed it's everybody else except me, but this is a very fundamental question, because if I don't own my life, what have I got? I have no freedom at all. I have no free will. At the end of the day, this is a debate between free will or imposed will. And I cannot, even though I don't intend to euthanize myself at any stage that I can foresee, I don't intend to do that, but I will not hand away my free will.
Thank you. And that was perfect timing, exactly 1 minute. Okay, somebody to speak against the motion, and then what I'll do is I'm going to come and I'm going to start off with you, Scott, so be warned. Yes.
Hi, my name's Jo Dellett. I'm a registered nurse of 30 years, and I'd just like to make a couple of points. Dying, just like living, can be messy, and it can involve suffering and sadness, and it can be painful. But euthanasia is not the only alternative. If we can send a spacecraft to Mars, surely we can, within our existing healthcare system, provide compassionate care that reduces suffering to an absolute minimum. It's not black and white, live or die. Yes, we have a right to make choices, and you can currently, as a Victorian civilian, refuse medical treatment by using a refusal of treatment certificate under the current law, under the Medical Treatment Act, or you can appoint an advocate who can refuse treatment on your behalf and who can advocate for the best possible palliative care to reduce suffering and to give you the kind of death that you deserve and that you need, which is one that minimises suffering. But it's not just live or die, it's definitely how we do it, but we can create a better system in the current system we have to improve care of those that suffer.
Thank you. Now, I'm going to try and get through as many people as I can, so please bear with me, but I just want to start off with some questions really directed to this side first, and you might want to comment on some of the answers. Scott, there have been two speakers now who've been speaking for the motion who have asserted quite passionately their right to choose as part of free will or simply as a right, and this is something that you fundamentally question. I just wonder if you could just pick up on this as to whether you are so certain in your own mind that right to choose should be subordinated to the interests of others.
Thank you very much for both of those questions, and my deepest respect to those who raised them, especially you, good sir, for doing so passionately. You said that there are two options. One is that you choose for yourself, your free will, and the other is imposition. I'd like to suggest, though, that those are not the only two options. I often think that freedom is overrated. Because you have to begin asking, well, freedom to do what? That's one question, of course, but I think there's a deeper question behind that. Where does your sense of freedom come from in the first place? What defines it? In many places within both the philosophical but also theological traditions of the West, freedom is defined not by the ability to choose what you want, but the ability to choose what is best. And I think the idea that the state, with all respect to Philip as well, the fact that the state is simply this overbearing monster, it may very well be, but that's not the real enemy, I think, that we're talking about here. The enemy is that we fundamentally abdicated the social responsibility. This is something that happens organically within society itself. The social responsibility to educate, to shape, to create systems of value. In other words, I think free will is important, but I think that free will has to be defined by the experience of life, of friendships, and community. One of the thing that I'll say is I often hear people say that life is a gift. Well, what sort of gift is it if I can't give it away, if I can't do something with it? What I'd like to suggest is that most fundamentally, human life isn't a gift to ourselves, but rather our lives are gifts to those who love us and those that we love. And it seems to me that that then begins to redefine so many of the rights that we begin claiming in debates such as these.
Scott, would I be right in thinking that you think that suicide is wrong then? To choose to end your own life, not only to ask someone else to do it, is that right?
Yes, I do, but I would not agree with the traditional, particularly Catholic objections to suicide, that it's a sin against one's own body.
Does anybody here want to comment on Scott's very strong and clear view that freedom of choice is not the point that should be pressed here?
I wanted to comment on one thing, Scott. I mean, you're talking about the monster thesis, and you're going on about fact that I described the state as being monstrous, but hell, you're the one who brought up the many hydra-headed monster. You're the one who somehow managed to get it into the final solution. You managed to work that into your text and somehow got onto abortion, for Christ's sake. So I don't know how you did it, but these are concepts which I'm a little bit sceptical about here.
Okay.
I just want to comment on Scott's comment that free will has to be defined. Well, I would say by whom? My mother's life was certainly a gift, and my life is the gift that she gave me, and that's why I respect her free will.
Now, Bill, there was a kind of a comment/clarification sought from you about whether or not the introduction of laws allowing voluntary assisted euthanasia in places like the Netherlands and Belgium, on your evidence, seems to have improved the regime for palliative care and advanced care directives. Is that what you were suggesting has happened?
No, the two are not linked.
I see. Right.
The fact that voluntary euthanasia has been introduced in the Netherlands and Belgium may well have inadvertently raised awareness amongst the doctors there. So in fact, what we've seen is that voluntary euthanasia has not gone up in those countries since it was legalised, and therefore there's not a need that it's been met. Improved palliative care has made the difference and increasing the awareness. I think the other point to make is that really this is the thin edge of the wedge. If we talk about, as Lone Skeen talked about, giving people the opportunity to have this gap met, well, where do we draw the line? What's the entry criteria to that room of death? Is it existential suffering? Is it someone who's depressed can then have a doctor take their life? What if they're just a bit tired of life? What do they feel that they're a burden on their family? So the other point is, how do we know it's free choice? When we talk about free choice, I know as doctors, we can talk people in or out of almost anything. And particularly when they're vulnerable, that is absolutely accentuated. So if that's the possibility, and once you euthanize someone, there's no going back, then I see that the state is actually there to protect ourselves.
Okay. So
in the same way as seatbelts, drinking and driving and so on, the state is there to protect ourselves.
You've gone a bit further than the question about the connection between the two and made some additional points. So I think I'll come back in a moment to see what might be the criteria you would recommend to ensure that people are not just being talked into an early death, and is this something which is available to people who are feeling sad? And do you want to comment on that now, do you, Lowen?
I might wait till I get my 2 minutes
Just do it now briefly and then I'll come to the audience.
Yes, I don't think that anybody is suggesting that people should have it on demand. There will always be a review process, and this could be initiated by other people, as I'll explain later.
Okay, so let's go back to the floor. Is there somebody here who wants to speak for the motion on this side? Yes, you come to the front if you're for the motion. Are you for the motion, sir? Okay, so there's somebody at the front, so the microphone 2 over here. You turn it up, please. Yep.
My name is Dr. Rodney Syme. I've been a long-term involvement in helping people at the end of their lives. I'd like to address a question to Bill Silvester. You suggested there were 5 criteria which were necessary for a good death, and the third one was a sense of having control. I'd suggest to you that while the control over the end of the life rests with the doctor, the patient does not have control.
Somebody on this side who is against the motion? Anybody here against? No? Somebody against the motion here on this side? No. Is there anybody who wants to speak against the motion at the moment? I'll give you priority to leap to the front, otherwise I'm going to go just in the order in which people have turned up for the time being. Okay, so there's somebody here, you're against the motion?
I was surprised to actually change my mind throughout this debate. I've always, for a long time, been very much for euthanasia, but I sense that there's a moral hazard that emerges when people can take their lives easily. Not to say that we wouldn't have some kind of stopgap to prevent people from making, decisions in the heat of the moment, but more that if people, a thought that occurred to me was that if people can take their lives when they're in immense pain, the number of people in that situation will decline, yes. But will we lose the incentive to find treatments for these conditions?
What I'm going to do now is just go in the order in which people are there for a while. But let me clarify, I may have muddied the waters a little bit by asking Scott Stevens his views about suicide, but that's not what we're debating tonight. It's not whether or not you can choose to die. We're trying to decide, should the law be changed to allow another person on a voluntary basis to assist you to die? That's the issue. So let's take a few people from the floor. You each get a minute, so your name and your minute begins now, sir.
Alan Rothschild. I'm a research lawyer. this statement's addressed to, the opposition, those against. There are the three Benelux countries, Netherlands, Belgium, Luxembourg, have all legislated for euthanasia. 2 states in America have legislated for assisted dying, otherwise known as assisted suicide, Oregon and Washington. None of those societies have fallen into an abyss. Each of those societies report heavily, specifically to Dr. Silvester. I'm happy to debate with you till the cows come home as far as statistics go on the Netherlands, particularly Australian studies and Netherlands studies, which show that non-voluntary euthanasia in Australia far exceeds that in the Netherlands.
Thank you. And we'll move across to this side, microphone 1.
My name's Lily. I'm also a registered nurse in Melbourne. I work in an acute care setting where I regularly see people die what I would call not a good death, which I would attribute to an inadequate training of medical and nursing staff in palliative care who are not palliative care specialists. There's also often long wait times for hospice beds, as well as a complete lack of support for families to have in-home care to allow their family members to die with them in the home. I would like to ask William whether or not he foresees a situation where palliative care could ever be given the kind of funding that could allow everybody a good death. And if not, can we really justify denying them another option?
I'm going to take 2 more from the floor and then we'll come back to the panel. Yes?
Thank you. I'm William Pauls. I'm a teacher. I just wanted to challenge the negative side on their outlook. Scott Stevens, you were saying if only we could treat nursing home patients better, then things would be certainly so much better and we wouldn't have to resort to euthanasia. And then Professor Silvester, you were singing the praises of the palliative care system, but from the lady we just heard from, it appears that there are serious gaps in the palliative care system, even though it's a very good system. Now, seeing these gaps and these problems exist, surely the denial of euthanasia is something like a utopian view when we have such a negative kind of situation for the aged.
And one last person here, and then we'll come back.
Good evening. My name's Bertha. I'm a 64-year-old mother of Jason Franklin that Philip mentioned earlier in his speech. My son does have an advanced care plan at the Austin, which he put in place quite a number of years ago after massive surgery in 2007, which went for 18 hours and then he had to be returned to theatre, which if we may have had that in place, he may have not had to suffer. He is on pain medication, which is a liquid medication because of he has such short gut, but nobody is sure of how much he is absorbing of that. So the only real answer to that would be some kind of palliative care, which because he is not terminal, probably would not come to his aid. So even though it is a very stressful thing, I support his decision for euthanasia because it is not a matter of just giving up. He had to go through a psych evaluation to sign that the care plan, and he was assessed as being of fit mind to do that. And so he's still of fit mind to make this decision, and I support him right down to the end of this road.
Thank you. Well, Bill, there have been a number of comments directed to you. One is from a colleague, doctor, who is saying that if one of the 5 things that people value is control, how can that be considered granted to a person when ultimately it's the doctor who is deciding? And secondly, there have been a number of questions about if society chooses not to fund the palliative care system to the degree that I think you would like it to. I think they're asking, isn't then in those circumstances the availability of euthanasia a reasonable thing to provide in the absence of that alternative?
Thank you. Well, the way I'd respond to the comment about lack of control, I think indicates that there's not a good understanding about what advanced care planning can deliver and what advanced care directives are able to do to support a patient having a say about what's going to happen in the future. The whole point of a refusal treatment certificate or any of the other legal documents is that those patients can then put in place that they do not want treatments that they choose not to have from now to the future. In fact, when we do advanced care planning, we empower patients to have a say about what's going on now. We've seen many patients who said, I now want to have the tracheostomy out. I now want to refuse any further surgery, blood transfusions, antibiotics. And that is then followed. So in fact, they do have control through advanced care planning.
And on the issue that, in a sense, if society won't fund a palliative care regime available to all who need it, would you agree, as they're putting to you, that in those circumstances euthanasia is a reasonable alternative?
Well, no, in fact, I think it's asking the wrong question. If the state is not funding palliative care correctly, we need to be going to the state and saying we need more funding for palliative care. But to then assume that because the state's not providing that, we then put in a whole new legal system which is going to require many more checks and balances, would be in fact much more expensive. The cheaper option and the more appropriate and ethical option is to provide proper palliative care, which is exactly what we're on about through our International Society of Advanced Care Planning and End-of-Life Care.
Shakira?
So I'd like to note that there are other, what would you call it, communities or groups of people in our society where there are very high suicide rates, groups of people who are facing seemingly intractable and very difficult social situations, but we don't regard assisting suicide as the productive way to deal with them. Suicide rates in some Indigenous communities are frighteningly high. Suicide rates among asylum seekers who have really seen just about the worst that this can have to offer. And I'll say as a side note, my MS diagnosis was easier to take from having not long beforehand done fieldwork in Afghan refugees in Pakistan, because it made me feel that no disease, no matter what, could be as bad as the suffering that had been undergone by some of the people I'd interviewed. My family, my loved ones were safe. I was in a country with a, imperfect, as we've noted, but functioning health system. But I'll get back to that. We don't think that the appropriate way for governments to respond to that is saying, look, you're right, life sucks. And your community, it's going to take a long time to fix those problems, and it probably won't happen for your generation. And we understand why you tried to kill yourself. And look, we'll provide a faster, more effective, less messy way for you to do it. That's not a proposition that anybody would make, and rightly so. So I know the slippery slope argument with euthanasia is seen as being, scaremongering in the cheap way. And yeah, I'm not fond of it myself. But I think that if we are to avoid these discriminations between different types of suffering and what is and isn't acceptable to help you on your way just right away from it, then we have to be prepared to ride that slippery slope all the way to the bottom, and I don't think we are.
Thank you. I'm going to... please applaud. I want to get one quick response on the slippery slope argument, which has come up a few times, or on other things that have been raised here. Then I've got to go. What I'll only be able to do is to take 4 more people from the audience before we need to start summing up and collecting the ballot. So,
with respect to Dr. Hussain, I think that the argument with regard to suicide by people with mental or social problems is a quite different situation from what we're discussing today. We're looking at the right of competent people or people who are acting on their behalf if they're not able to make their own decisions, to make decisions at the end of life. I would like to ask a different sort of question, both of our opponents and also perhaps of Dr. Nitschke or Dr. Rodney Syme. And it relates to what we see as a gap in the situations where palliative care is able to solve all the patient's problems. I'm not a doctor, but I've read a great deal about the situations where people say, what I want can't be given to me by pain relief. So I invite anyone to speak on that issue.
Okay, I'm going to come back to that in a moment. Thanks, Lowen. Now, apologies to those who've been waiting a long time. I've only got time now to take 4 people more speaking from the floor, and I'll take 2 from each side. So if you'll each have a minute, if you go shorter, I might fit somebody else in. So away you go.
My name's Daniel. So one thing that Mr. Stevens has said is that our approach to freedom today means that we don't approach our obligations responsibly. And I agree that we are born into obligation to our loved ones. But I think that we need to ask what the nature and content of those obligations are. And I think that that's a matter for discussion and communication between those people that love each other. And if they decide that it is consistent with their obligations to each other to help and assist one person leave the world and leave the pain that they're in, then why should the state be involved in that discussion and that communication?
Microphone 1.
My name's Michael. I'd like to thank you all for a wonderful debate. I'm a doctor who works in palliative care, and I had a question in regards to relating to the many challenges that we face working within the field of palliative care are fears of medications and their effects, such as morphine, and that palliative care could be equated with a person now being given up on. We would frequently spend time allaying these fears and aiding people making choices that fulfill the realistic hopes that they have based on their situation. And I would just ask the panel to address the question, is there any risk that through the way this important debate is conducted, that we may actually turn some people away from the care, the palliative care that they may need through some of the fears that are raised through this debate? Thank you.
Ruth Friedman with a question for Bill Silvester. I just wondered if you could elaborate on the situation where people are not terminal and they're not in pain and they're not needing to make a decision about withdrawal of treatment, how you could actually argue your position for those people.
Hi there, my name's Luke Scholes, and I'm here tonight because and I'm sure like many other people, I've witnessed the unnecessary suffering of loved ones. I just want to suggest a couple of little things that Professor Silvester brought up tonight, and that's that the opportunity to design, to develop and to consult on something like an advanced care plan is the opportunity that very, very few people have. It may be your experience that you are to develop things like that with people, but my experience, we didn't have the opportunity to do such a thing. And also, with regard to your comment about, and the fact also that the law change in the Netherlands has seen no increase in voluntary euthanasia, and your suggestion that there is no need being met, I might suggest that that need is being met in the minds and the hearts of people who are concerned about the way they're going to die.
Thank you. Thank you. All right. I think I can fit in one last person here, I think, and I think that might be it. Yes?
My name is Geraldine Kunstler, and I'm only going to ask, not ask even anything, state two things. Number one, when Scott spoke about freedom, was he talking about freedom to or freedom from? Now, freedom from is totally impossible for people with dementia, Alzheimer's, or whatever, and they are not in any position to make decisions. And the other question is to Professor Silvester, how does palliative care differ quantitatively from euthanasia? It's just, in my book, slow euthanasia. Thank you.
Well, thank you for your questions and comments, and I'm going to ask our panellists to address those so far unanswered questions as they sum up. So if you could wrap in some answers to that, particularly this issue about palliative care, what to do when it's not effective, when it's not available, or advanced care directives haven't been made available, and this gap that was asked about between what palliative care can and can't do. As this happens, and I'll ask you to listen to these remarks. They'll be given 2 minutes each to our speakers in the order in which they first spoke. So, Bill, you'll have some time to prepare your final remarks. You're going to be asked to vote, even though they're still summing up. The core arguments will have been put. And I'd remind you now when you vote that you should have a voting slip. If you're undecided, if you don't want to cast a for or against, and it may not be that you're undecided, you may not simply want to do that because you think it's too complex an issue to be reduced to this, then just put your vote in, still join together. Otherwise, please tear it in half and put for or against as you're inclined to do. It will be 2 minutes for each of the speakers as the ballots come around, starting with Beth Wilson. Beth, you can address the issues that have been made or introduce new points. Your 2 minutes begin now.
Well, thank you for allowing me to be involved. It's been really, really interesting. It was not supposed to be a debate about suicide. I respect Shakira's desire to choose what happens to her, but she can't decide what should happen for me. I claim that right for myself. I'm fascinated by Scott's characterisation of our society as one in which we have abandoned our elderly. It's a great insult to every single worker in aged care services. And of course, not all of our elderly people are in nursing homes or in residential care. There's many, many of them living very happy, healthy lives in a society that has not abandoned them. The concept of being afraid to be loved, Scott, I'm very worried about you. I'm not afraid to be loved. Is there anyone out there who thinks they could possibly love me? Yes. Thank you, Lowen. And of course, Bill Silvester, I've always respected the fantastic work that he does. However, he is a doctor and he just can't help being a little bit paternalistic. He really does love helping people, but finds it a little harder to think that they may know how they do or don't want to be helped. The slippery slope, well, frankly, I think we should ban birth because birth leads to death.
Thank you. Dr. Shakira Hussain.
From the floor by Janarian, actually, it was a comment from the floor. She said, when she's asked how she is, she says, well, considering my age. And I tempted to say, well, considering my MRI scans, which apparently are a lot worse than my physical mobility. But anyhow, but I'm coming back to that point about when it's rational and appropriate to assist suicide. And I would say to Lorne, who talked about how we are talking about people who are competent to make that decision, I can introduce you to some suicidally depressed asylum seekers, say, who have survived the most horrific experiences, that it would be an insult for me to say, well, you can just get over that, heal, start again, discover, the joy of life, smell the roses. I wouldn't dare to do that, but I would not think it appropriate to help them die either. And I would not describe them as incompetent, not remotely. So why distinguish between when it is or isn't appropriate to judge that it's okay to help somebody on their way? I would not judge somebody as an ethically or morally lesser being because they couldn't manage to take another single step, just couldn't manage to keep putting one foot after another. But I would not either push them out the door.
Thank you.
I want to pick up a number of fears that people have expressed, both our opponents and from the wider audience, that changing the law might endorse medical killing, that it would be state regulated and the state would decide whose life has less value. That people would be shunning responsibility for the care of their elderly, that human dignity is stripped back. Now, all of these fears assume that it'll be the doctors who are making these decisions and or greedy relatives. And I think it's important to bear in mind from the perspective of the law that we have a very careful system of review of decision-making. And anybody who is concerned about the treatment that a patient is having in hospital can apply to have that decision reviewed by a court or a tribunal. And you may think that the courts and tribunals are likely to give the nod to this person being swiftly dispatched, particularly if medical views seem to support that. But on the contrary, when you read the case law, the judges are very careful to assess the person's likely quality of life. And if the person has a quality of life that even is of value to them, that we would not imagine for ourselves that we would want to have a life limited in that way, just to feel the wind through her hair, as was said in a recent English case, to be able to smile when a song is played. In that case, the court would not approve the removal of treatment from that woman because there was still value in her life. So I think we can trust our courts and tribunals to watch over all this very carefully.
Scott Stevens.
Philip began his remarks by asking, should we leave things as they are? Philip, I suspect that is our one point of agreement this evening. I do not believe that things should simply stay as they are. We have created an anomalous, oftentimes cruel, most often capricious system. And we can, I think, through the debate tonight, we can see many of the gaps, many of the contradictions that are beginning to emerge. Where I'd fundamentally disagree with Philip is that I refuse to give up on a more organic, healthy, rich, social, societally based solution to many of the things that we've discussed tonight. I do think that the way in which, and this is part of the testimony of many of those who work within third-party aged care, I do think that the way in which many families and many aspects of our society have abdicated our responsibility for the elderly, that's no disrespect to those who work in the sector. It's actually part of the testimony of those who work within the sector. One of the things that I do think is becoming incredibly important is that we retrieve the notion of hospitality that lies at the heart of the hospital and hospice system. One of the great Christian revolutions of the 4th century right up to the 11th century was the intention to bring the dying in from outside of the walls of the city and to integrate them within the life of human society itself. Part of that was bringing cemeteries from outside of the city into churchyards, into the city itself. In other words, to embrace the process of dying with intense friendship, companionship. This is what many Christian theologians refer to as the double defeat of death. Christ has overcome death in the resurrection, but now it's our responsibility to help those that we love through the process of dying, and dying finally with dignity.
Phil Nishkin.
The thing I don't like about coming to debates like this is that the opposition always get all the questions. And so we sit here and have to just simply provide feedback on their answers to the questions, which the audience overwhelmingly, I would say, support legalising voluntary euthanasia. But nevertheless, just looking at a couple of the themes which have emerged, and I suppose just by way, I should say at the conclusion, look, Scott, I know you are looking towards this healthy, rich, societal-based solution, but don't contrast that with me, presumably someone who's looking for an unhealthy, impoverished, non-societal-based solution. That's not where I'm coming from either. But some of the themes that have emerged really do relate or come back to this question of control And this comes up with Professor Bill to some, this come up repeatedly with him, and he says, when you give people control, when you listen to them, ask them what they want, they regain control. But that, as Rodney Syme said, is only partial control when you are the one who makes the final decision. True control is when you give the control back to the patient. And that's something which can never come in the current situation without changing the law. Now, palliative care is incredibly important. It's come up at time and time again. All of the people I know, those in serious health problems, those who are dying, want it, want to see what it can deliver, but we shouldn't be telling them that that is the start and the finish. They want to try it. Some will turn away from it. Some will find it provides all of their solutions. But when I come to someone like Jay Franklin, who's had 30 years of this, he's had the best palliative care in Melbourne can offer. He's had the best medical treatment that can be provided in Melbourne. And he, at that stage, has talked about his plans, his advanced plan, his future plan directives, and he still says, look, I want access to a peaceful death, and the best we can give for him is a one-way ticket to Zurich. I think we can do better.
Bill?
In my final comments, I'm going to try and cover some of the questions and comments that were raised. Let's not beat around the bush on this. Euthanasia is a deliberate taking of life, whereas palliative care is the caring, compassionate treatment of a patient's suffering and helping them to live as well as possible. So if those of you in the audience or on this panel are not happy with the delivery of care at the end of life, then do something about it. What are you all doing about it? I'm committing my career to working on this. I'm meeting with the Minister for Ageing next week to talk about this, as I have done before. So I'd ask all of you, why don't you do something about it? If you're unhappy with the level of palliative care in this state, in this country, then contact your local member of parliament and make a point that you think things need to improve. Now, Beth, who I have great respect for, I think you're actually a bit disingenuous about suggesting I'm paternalistic when, in fact, I run a program called Respecting Patient Choices, which is, in fact, moving the pendulum towards teaching doctors and nurses to ask patients about what they want and respecting that at the end of life. I also agree that advanced care planning should be much more available than it is at the moment. My contention is that it should be available to all people in any stage of illness or health and for every resident in the nursing homes in Australia. Now, Beth emphasised that it's about choice, but there's the rub. How do we know it's free choice? I've already pointed out that doctors can talk patients in and out of any treatment, and there's no going back. Our respect for elderly people is that we would not expose them to the risk of voluntary euthanasia. And state-sponsored death is a step too far and not a step that this doctor wishes to take. I think the main risk from a doctor's perspective is that patients, particularly the elderly who are vulnerable because of recent or chronic illness, feeling like they are in the way, a burden to their family and to the health system, who will be coerced, whether it be subtly or inadvertently, to see the only solution to their predicament is to end it all. Thank you.
Before I wind up and we find out what the result is, there must be some cases where palliative care is unable to relieve suffering. Is that there are some cases? What then?
I'm sure, in fact, I'm aware that there are some cases where patients have got to a point where they believe that their level of function in life, their ability to conduct a life that they see as acceptable, particularly when they have a terminal condition, is a state of health that cannot be treated by giving morphine or some other sort of medication. And I labour over those cases myself. But what I believe, what I truly believe, I'm not just saying this as part of tonight's debate, is that the great risk of the many people, if we did introduce legalised euthanasia, would far outweigh the suffering of those few people. Now, one thing we haven't touched on tonight, and, it's very easy for Philip to say, well, this guy's got to go and find someone else who's got some money to go off to Switzerland. Anyone can stop eating and drinking if they like. Within 10 days, well, it's true.
But that is a terrible thing to do, isn't it?
Well, in fact, I'm happy to share the research with you, but in fact, we have had many cases where people have chosen at a state of ill health to stop eating and drinking, and in fact, they don't suffer, and it usually means that within about 10 days they've died because of kidney failure.
Okay.
And it is a not suffering death.
Okay, thank you. People, as I said at the beginning, it's about respectful, even passionate disagreement, but always respectful. In a moment, I'm going to get I hope the vote's been counted. Before I do that, I want to thank people for this debate. They're the people who put it on, the Wheeler Centre, staff here from St James Ethics Centre, the management of the Town Hall, the Age, the ABC, and the Mayor and the Aldermen and the officers of the City of Melbourne who also support these debates, and of course our supporters, AMP. And before we hear the results, I'd just like, whatever the result happens to be, to thank our speakers. So would you join with me, please, in thanking Beth Wilson, Lowen Scheme, Philip Nisky, Shakira Hussain, Scott Stevens and Bill Silvester. Now, some people think that for topics as serious as this, that a debate's not a very good way to proceed, that deliberative democracy and other things would do it. What we hope with these debates is that they help to advance the conversation and the deliberation will take place afterwards. And I should also explain about these results that, there was a pre-poll and then there was an after poll, the one that you just cast. And some people judge these things by the absolute numbers and sometimes it's by the size of the swing. So, here's the results. At the beginning of this debate, 7.5% were against the motion, 10.5% did not know, and 82% were for the motion. At the end of the debate, the undecided have reduced, not by a huge amount, but down to 6%. Against the motion, 9%, but with a significant margin, the motion is won by the affirmative with a vote of 85% in favour. This is the last debate for the year. We hope you've enjoyed the season if you've attended other debates, and we look forward to bringing more to you in 2013. I'd ask you when you go, there's various bits and pieces of paper, order papers and things, if you could take them with you from here in the Town Hall. But finally, I'd like to thank all of you as members of this House for your support and participation in this debate, which I now declare to be closed. Good evening.